Welcome and greetings to all of you. Patricia and I are delighted to once again host the CIL Distinguished Speakers Lectures, and we are absolutely thrilled to have someone who truly does not need an introduction. We always say this because it's true, and that is Professor Tommy Koh, the amazing Professor Tommy Koh. And our topic today is perhaps almost a forgotten anniversary, a 30-year reflection of the 1992 Rio Conference on the environment and development and the question about have states failed. And before I give the floor over to Professor Tommy Koh, I'm going to make an introduction, and believe me, this is just a fraction of what Tommy Koh has achieved in his remarkable life. Of course, he's very well known as the former president of the Third Conference on the Law of the Sea, but he's done many other things as well. He is currently ambassador at large for the Singaporean government. He was professor of law at the National University of Singapore. He was also Singapore's ambassador to the UN and permanent representative to the United Nations. He has received many, many awards, but there's one I found, and I think it really reflects just the diplomatic side of Tommy Koh. In 2014, he received the Great Negotiator Award from Harvard Law School. And believe me, there's reasons for that. We just don't have time. And I also know he's an incredibly prolific writer and initiates others to write minimum 2 books a year. So much more to say, but one thing, and I just think that we are so fortunate to have someone, and it's not by accident that he was also invited to chair the UN, the preparatory committee for the UN Conference on the Environment and Development, the Earth Summit, that was held in Rio in 1990. He presided over the preparations and negotiations. And this, I think, is really important because even though we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Stockholm, the Earth Summit produced the most influential instruments to guide states in environmental matters: climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. So we are extremely fortunate to have you, Tommy, as our guest.
Thank you.
And take this opportunity with someone with your, very unique insights from inside and outside. And you are a vocal person, and you've made some, pretty strong comments about the state of the environment today. So Patricia and I, this is going to be a conversation. Patricia and I are going to ask some questions, but if you wanted to start off by making some comments first, please do. Otherwise, we can start with the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Nilufer, for your very kind introduction. I want to make 2 points in the beginning. First, I was a member of the preparatory committee for the Stockholm Conference, because I was at the UN from 1968 to 1971. And I think in about 1969 or 70, the UN set up a preparatory committee for the Stockholm Conference. Not many developing countries were interested, but I was very interested because we were struggling in Singapore with the need to reconcile our wish to grow rapidly, but at the same time not to damage our environment and to maintain a high quality environmental life. So I joined the preparatory committee, and I spent most of my time during that period fighting against Brazil. Yes, yes, because Brazil played a very negative role in the PrepCon. Brazil was telling all the developing countries not to attend Stockholm, that it was a conspiracy by the developed countries to retard the development of the developing country. And my job in the PrepCon was to debate Brazil and say this is not true, So that's my first point. My second point is that I had no intention to be chairman of the PrepCon for UNCED in Rio 92, but something happened. Sweden had wanted to chair the preparatory committee for the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. And a month before the PrepCom was to convene, the UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar appointed a Canadian, Maurice Strong, to be the conference Secretary General. 20 years earlier, he was also the Secretary General of the Stockholm Conference. So he knows a lot about the subject. He's a very good diplomat. So when the UN Secretary General appointed him to be the Secretary General, the developing country said to the UN, in that case, the chairman of the PrepCom must come from a developing country. So this is February 1990. And my two colleagues, one at the UN, Prof. Chan Heng Ji, and one in Singapore, Kishore Mahbubani, then wrote to me and said, the UN is looking for somebody to chair the PrepCom. We think you should do it. And compared to UNCLOS, it will be a piece of cake, you know. So I foolishly believed Kishore Mahbubani and said, okay. So I was elected chairman of the PrepCom unopposed. Nobody wanted the job. Then I went to New York in March to chair the 2-week-long organizing session, the main purpose of which was to adopt an agenda. And you know, I was shocked. You know, in 1989, the Cold War ended. In 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved. So the Cold War was over, you know, but the US-Soviet Union Cold War was replaced by a North-South Cold War. So I was very shocked when I went to New York in March 1990 to find that there was a complete absence of trust between the developed country and developing country. And after 2 weeks, we still couldn't agree on the agenda. You know, it's absurd, you know. But I was determined to get one. So on the last day, I told the secretariat, I'm going to meet through the night until we get an agenda. The secretary didn't believe me, you know. So after midnight, we had no interpreters. And I had to go and plead with different language groups to please let us continue without the benefit of interpreters. So I went through the night, and it was sometime early the next morning when all the delegates were exhausted. Then they asked for an adjournment and asked to see me in a little room next to the conference room. And they said, Chairman, we are now prepared to make a deal. Can you offer us a chairman's compromise draft? You know, I was waiting for the moment, you know. I was going to wait them out, exhaust them until we're ready to make a deal. And then I invited about a dozen of them to sit with me at a long table. And within an hour, we produced a draft, which was accepted by the PrepCom. So that was an important first step I took, which is that I intended to impose discipline on the PrepCom. And I'm not going to allow a few delegations to block our program, you know, and just keep on speaking ad nauseum, you know. So I'll just let them speak until they're exhausted. And then when they're ready to make a deal, I'm ready to help them make a deal, you know. So that I always remember that first meeting of the PrepCom in New York, which ended at early in the morning the next day, you know.
Well, Tommy, we know why you got that award as a great negotiator. This is a skill. And I have to say, these are insights that they don't give you in the textbooks. And I think it's so important to understanding, you know, the making of international law and these conventions. So this is wonderful, really. So please give us these little tidbits. No, not little, actually.
I also did something very sneaky, which is that until then, all conference room at the UN allowed for smoking, you know, which I hated, you know. So at the beginning of PrepCom, I said, you know, one of the things we're fighting against is air pollution. And we should set an example by banning smoking at all our meetings. And before the smokers could galvanize and oppose me, I took up the gavel and counted to 5 and said, it is so decided. So that was a very important decision we made to ban smoking at all our meetings. And when some of the colleagues tried to defy this rule, I remember the Saudi lighting up with a cigar, I stopped him. I said, will you please leave the room and smoke outside, you know?
And only Tommy Koh could get away with that, I think. But you certainly got the smokers' attention. That's great. That's wonderful, really.
They hated me.
No, I doubt that. And I'm sure that's why you're so effective. That's wonderful, Tommy. Well, let's start off with some of our questions. Okay. I'm going to go with the first one. So if you could share with us in the preparation for UNCIT, what were the expectations of states? And you as the chair, what was your expectation? And I know it's a big question, it's a compound question, but do you feel that UNCIT achieved these expectations at the time? I mean, this is for the negotiations, not the outcome, but during the negotiations.
We were hoping to arrive at some consensus on protecting the atmosphere. You know, this is the beginning of our journey on climate change. And on a parallel track, colleagues are negotiating the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we are hoping they'll complete their work in time, and UNFCCC will be open for signature in Rio. Then on another parallel track, some colleagues were negotiating the Convention on Biological Diversity, you know. So we were also hoping that they will succeed in their work, and the CBD convention will also be signed in Rio. The most divisive issue in Rio was forests, you know. And I really worked hard to bridge the gap between North and South on forests. We couldn't agree on a treaty, so eventually what I did was I appointed a negotiating group at the level of ministers. I appointed the German Minister for the Environment, Dr. Klaus Toffer, to chair this negotiating group. And he succeeded in producing a non-binding statement of principles on forests. So in 1992, forest was the most divisive issue, you know? So when I look at what happened in COP26, when all the major countries that host rainforests signed a pledge that they will stop deforestation by 2030. I mean, to me, this is like a miracle, you know, when I think back 30 years to what happened in Rio 92, you know. But I also took the opportunity of Rio to give the UN 2 mandates. One, to negotiate a new treaty to combat desertification. This is what my African brothers wanted, you know. And I also give the UN a mandate to negotiate a new agreement on straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stock, which was done, you know, in 1995. So those were our expectations. On forests, we couldn't get more than just a non-legally binding statement of principle, but it was the first step. Until then, there was no international agreement on forests, you know, but it was very hard fought. And I pay my compliments to my German colleague, Klaus Toffer, who subsequently became, as you know, the head of UNEP. Yeah?
Yes, a very effective one. So, and just very quickly, and Patricia will follow, on the desertification, I didn't realize that because it's the trilogy.
Yeah.
But that is such an important, but I think also under the radar convention, but with climate change, it's so important. So that's really interesting background information. Patricia, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to follow up now on the Rio declaration, of course. Besides the outcomes in terms of conventions, of course, the soft law instrument, it was so it is still so important, the 1992 Rio Declarations and its principles, and they are core to international environmental law today. And you played an important role in the drafting of the Rio principles. And we wanted to hear from you also again, and I'm sure that you're going to tell us things that we don't know about the process and about how the principles were developed.
Okay. So this is the story. At the PrepCom, we had 3 main committees, and the drafting of the Declaration of Principle was assigned to Committee 3. The chairman of Committee 3 was a very distinguished scientist from Czechoslovakia, and his name was Bedřich Modan. But he was an inexperienced diplomat, you know. So at the final session of the PrepCom in New York, when the two sides, the North and South, couldn't agree, Dr. Modan prematurely offered the chairman's compromise proposal. So one of the lessons learned is that in negotiation, timing is everything. And if you are the chairman, you must wait until the appropriate moment before you offer a compromise. If you offer it too early, it will be rejected and you damage your own credibility. So what happened is that when Dr. Modan offered his compromise proposal, it was rejected by both sides. And the developing country, in my view, falsely accused him of being biased in favor of developed country. They not only rejected his draft, but they refused to negotiate under his chairmanship, you know? Just terrible, you know? So they came to see me and said, can I take over? I said, no. I said, I must support my chairman, you know? So then what happened is that Norway and India took it upon themselves to co-chair an informal negotiation on the draft declaration. And this went on for several weeks. Then in the final days of the PrepCom in New York, Norway and India came to see me and said, we are unable to come to an agreement. We think it's time for you to take over the negotiation. So I went back to Dr. Bedřich Modan and asked him, do you have any objections if I now take over the negotiation? He said, no, please do it. Please do it. Well, we were desperate for an agreement. I knew that I had the power and they were supplicants, you know. So I told Norway and India that I will agree to chair this, provided we make it a limited close group of 16 delegations, 8 from the North and 8 from the South. And I asked Norway, you choose the OECD country, and I asked India to choose the country from the South. Then I also told them to give me a single negotiating text within 24 hours, which they did the next day, you know. And with a single negotiating text and the limited group of 16 delegations, you'll be happy to know that we arrive at the text we have in 24 hours. The lesson learned is that when the timing is right, you know, it is not difficult to come to an agreement. But if the timing is not right, delegation would dig in the hills, they would argue till the end of the world, and you never get anywhere, you know. So we got an agreement in 24 hours. Then, of course, I had to sell this agreement to the plenary, you know. So I explained to the plenary that I was requested by India and Norway to take over the negotiation. We had this small negotiating group of 16 representing North and South, and I asked the meeting to adopt this. The only delegation that opposed me was Israel, you know. And the Israeli opposed me because of one principle. Which is about the interests of people living in territories under foreign occupation, you know. So it's really filibustered me all night long, you know, in New York. At one point, they even called in a German and asked to see me privately in my office. And the head of the Israeli delegation was very rough with me, you know. He said, Singapore is a friend of Israel. I say, yes, we are your good friends. So you are behaving in a very unfriendly manner. And we're going to complain to your prime minister, you know. So I anticipated he'll do some nonsense like this. So I gave him the prime minister's telephone number and said, why didn't you call him now? I called it bluff, you know. So we went back to the meeting and I said, I'm going to rule that it's consensus to adopt the draft declaration. And if any delegation opposes me, I'm going to put his opposition to the vote. So I dared the Israeli to oppose me, but they didn't dare, you know, because they had no support, you know. Because the European, US were all in the negotiating group of 16, you know. In drafting the declaration, we look at the Stockholm Declaration and try to build on it, to try to go a bit further, you know. So some very important principles are the precautionary principle, you know, the environmental impact assessment, polluter pay, and so on, you know. At the time when we were drafting, we thought this is just soft law, but I had hoped that over time, some of the principles would be adopted by the courts and state practice and would become part of customary law.
Yes, which certainly some of them have, and it's a pity that we didn't manage to get the global pact on the environment, where those principles were supposed to then become hard law. But I think you're absolutely right in saying that some of those principles are today part of customary international law. The International Court of Justice and other international courts and tribunals have been using them. And so, although it is indeed a soft law declaration, its impacts is enduring and we'll come back to an assessment of the Rio process later. So, Nilofer, back to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. And I have to say, I'm learning things listening to you, Tommy, and it was clear that, you know, a negotiator is not for the lighthearted. No. You really have to be tough in the timing. So this is very instructive and illuminating. And as Patricia knows on the principles, this is an issue that we're having a big debate, obviously, in the International Law Commission about the issue of what we call the second category principles that are derived from the international legal system. And one of these, of course, we're looking at are the Rio principles, for example. But that's another issue. But again, you know, they are such core principles, so important. Anyway, I'll stop. It's so interesting. There's so much we could talk about. But I'm going to go on now with the next question. Now, following up, of course, we know that the trio of conventions that were adopted in Rio, climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. Now, in a recent lecture, you made a very profound statement that, quote, on biodiversity, we've done disastrously. On climate change, the window's closing, an end quote. And I think a lot of us will agree with you. So 2 questions. Have states failed to meet their obligations in these 30 years? What needs to be done? And I'll just leave it there.
I think on the Convention on Biological Diversity, I think the states have failed. The problem is that it's hard to get people enthused about the importance of protecting species of wildlife, protecting ecosystem. They don't see the connection to their own health and well-being, you know. And, you know, as you know, there's a conference of parties under CBD. They also meet regularly, and they keep adopting all kinds of plans. But we never fulfill any of the plan, you know, and the situation is pretty bad, you know, that we are losing so many species that some of the scientists have actually called this the era of the 6th great extinction, you know. I don't know how to change course because biodiversity doesn't have the emotional pull and the real impact on our existence as climate change, you know. Climate change is now taken very seriously by all the countries, in all the people, in all the peoples of the world. If you look at the recent survey in Singapore, of what people are most concerned about, I was happy to see that climate change is one of them, because they can see the real impact of climate change in terms of sea level rise, of drought, of torrential rains and floods, But on climate change, as I said in the interview with Namal Ghosh, the window is closing because the scientists believe that the pledges made so far, the nationally determined contribution, in total, will not enable us to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees centigrade. I think the UNFCCC Secretariat calculated that on the basis of current pledges, we will be closer to 2.7 degrees, So that will be a disaster, right? I think this current decade is critical. Between 2020 and 2030, if we are not able to do more, then we will have lost. And I think that we will have to accept that 1.5 degree is not achievable. Perhaps even 2 degrees not achievable.
I think the point you made is so important, that from the bottom up connection, scientists understand when it comes to biodiversity. We had the first ever IPBES report came out a few years ago with pretty shocking, although not surprising, data on the loss of biodiversity, and we're looking to lose significant. But you're right. I mean, biodiversity may sound abstract to the people on the street, and it's not. Our well-being is so connected, and so. But states, there's a lot of meetings going on. You're absolutely right. And with climate change, this has been going on for 30 years. There's nothing new, but action has been so slow, and it's frustrating. I know Singapore, of course, has given a great deal of priority to climate change in many ways. But anyway, we still have a lot more to go.
I think we should not be pessimistic. I think that there's a new awareness in the world. And when I look at what happened in Glasgow, I think there was a sense of urgency that we must all do more, And I'm very encouraged by the fact that so many countries have pledged to be net zero by 2050. Even though it will be difficult, there will be economic costs involved to make this transition to a low carbon economy. But more and more governments are coming up and saying, we will be there. We will pledge to be carbon neutral by 2050, and I'm encouraged by that.
And industry as well, the private sector, very important.
Absolutely,
as part of it.
Absolutely. The majority of the leaders of private sector around the world have signed up to the Paris Agreement, and that is good news.
Patricia, over to you.
Yes, no, I mean, I was just listening to you now, and when we talk about what assessment can be done of the last 30 years since the 1992 UNCED in Rio, and it seems that it's a mixed balance. It's a mix. I mean, there are negative issues that still need to be addressed, but then at the same time, some positive developments since Rio, and I wanted for you to expand on those, on that balance.
Okay. As an optimistic person, I would like to look on the bright side of the picture first. So I asked myself, what have we achieved in the last 30 years? I think there are several important achievements. One, the ideological debate between North and South is over. There's no one in the South today who say this is a conspiracy by the North to retard our development. There's nobody in the South who say, let's get rich first and then we'll clean up the environment later. That era is over. There is really a universal consensus that we want both development and environment. And care for the environment must be part of the development process. So I think that's the first an important victory. Secondly, I say, I'm encouraged by the level of public awareness about nature and environment in all our countries, And you look at the public opinion polls in almost every country all over the world, the importance of protecting nature and environment has become a matter of public concern. I think that's good. And consumers are becoming more environmentally aware, and they want to buy products, to procure services from companies that are environmentally friendly, and to boycott those who are environmentally unfriendly. I also see a tremendous increase in involvement by young people. I look at Singapore, there are so many youth groups, and this is very encouraging because it portends well for the future, that the next generation are much more green than we are, much more concerned about protecting nature and environment than we are. So this is good news now. And I think the other good news is the private sector. In the bad old days, the business and industry were looked upon as the enemy. But today, business and industry is not the enemy. It's an ally in our common effort to protect our ecosystem, protect the atmosphere, protect the oceans. So those are tremendous improvement. So I'm not discouraged. I continue to worry that we're doing a very bad job in conserving our biodiversity. I worry that we may miss the target of 1.5 degrees. I think it hangs in the balance, but the battle is not lost. I think the next few years will determine whether we succeed or fail. And when I think of the next generation, I'm optimistic.
Yes, it's very good to hear those encouraging notes, and I also fully agree that the younger generations have a key role to play, and they've been playing it. I mean, in terms of in terms of public opinion, holding governments to their commitments, and stressing that. I mean, if things go wrong, it's not for the current generations, but for the future generations. And I think that intergenerational equity is really a key aspect of this discussion.
Yes.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that that's probably one of the strongest forces we have is the voice of youth. And I think it's no longer just being given lip service. Before you would have one young person making a talk as they did at the conferences, but now it's a movement, it's a youth movement.
Yeah.
And it's obviously it's their future. I mean,
and also the important role played by civil society and by the private sector. I'm very proud of the fact that in Rio, I opened the doors for the NGOs. For the first time in UN conference history, I allowed the NGO to come and speak to us. Instead of keeping them in an alternative universe, I decided, why don't we allow them to come and speak to us? They can't take part in decision making, but at least open the door, let them speak to us,
Okay, I don't know I didn't know that, Tommy, and I think many people don't know that. That's fairly revolutionary, actually.
Because I was, from my Law of the Sea experience, I found that the NGOs were very helpful. So I don't have a negative view, of NGOs as troublemakers. So during the PrepCon period, I managed to persuade the PrepCon to agree that we will open the doors, allow them to speak to us, rather than keep them in an alternative universe, which most UN conferences do. They organize a separate conference by NGOs, and there's no connection between the two. So I said, well, let's listen to them. Very often they are our conscience. They have fewer vested interests than we do. And I was also very keen to harness the power of the private sector. So it was my colleague Maurice Strong who set up this Business Council for the Environment, which played a very important role because the chairman, who was a very successful entrepreneur from Switzerland, Stefan Schmidt-Heine, he knew all the important CEOs of the world, and he managed to get all of them to join the Business Council for the Environment, and so we reach out to the NGO, reach out to the business community. And Maurice is such a wonderful showman, He went to visit practically every country in the world and told the government that this is no ordinary conference. This is a summit level conference. So will you send your president or prime minister to Rio, And you'll be surprised to know that of the 179 countries taking part in Rio, 116 heads of state and government came to Rio, including the Prime Minister of China, Li Peng, President of Indonesia, Suharto. In fact, at the lunch, I sat next to President Suharto. First time I had the opportunity to spend one whole hour with him and got to know him as a person, And Premier Li Peng was very happy that he could meet somebody who could speak his language,
Oh, that's amazing. I think that these are things, again, we don't know, and I see that very important seeds were sown. I mean, with allowing NGOs in, civil society, and I think now, you say, okay, 1992, they had the Rio Conference, but we don't know just what it took to put that conference together, actually. Going and reaching out, so much is taken for granted that you would bring in 112 heads of state. Okay, all right. Well, all right, let's continue, but this is, as I said, I'm learning a lot. This is so interesting.
Maybe we should take some questions from those who are listening.
Yeah, we will, but we have one more question and then we'll start taking. And so we invite our audience, and we have a good sized audience, to please submit questions to Tommy. So just one last question, and this is something that happened recently. And that is, as you know, 30 years after the Rio Conference, an important development was the recognition by the UN Rights Council and the General Assembly of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right.
Yeah.
So your thoughts on that?
I think it's a very important step, and this will put pressure on all the governments of the world, that it is their responsibility to fulfill the aspiration of their people to live in a clean environment. And I think we're beginning to see, for example, the government of China responding. The people of China have sent a clear message to their rulers that we want to live in a clean environment. We want to be able to breathe the air, drink the water, buy unpolluted food. So this has become a very important agenda of the government of the People's Republic of China. Whereas before, environment was subordinated to development, and they were in a hurry to catch up with the West. They just want a rapid development.
All right, shall we take some questions now?
Yeah.
So we have, let me see, question from, if I can say the name, Sudhir Verma. Thank you, Professor. There's two questions. How far do you think ESG can or should replace welfare, social environment, sustainability undertaken by states traditionally? This question is particularly concerning private sector.
Yeah.
And secondly, how can we impose obligations upon private sector and international law for the protection of the environment? ESG, do you know what that is? I'm bad with acronyms.
Yes, but
Okay.
ESG is relevant to the private sector, not public sector. Yeah, and ESG is good. I mean, I remember not so many years ago when the dominant view of capitalism was expounded by somebody who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman's view is that the only obligation of the company is to the shareholder, no, nothing else. Maximize profit, your responsibility to shareholder. We've come such a long way from Milton Friedman. We now say, it is not shareholder, there are many other stakeholders. And if you're a good company, you should care about the environment, about the social conditions and so on, So ESG is to me a tremendous progress compared to the past. The danger, of course, is greenwashing, that some company will say, I'm a good company and I uphold these objectives when they in fact don't, So greenwashing is a problem, but hey, I'd rather have ESG than no ESG.
Okay.
Second question.
The second question, how can, basically, how to impose obligations under international law upon private sector for the protection of the environment? It depends on the courts at the national level. And I must say, I'm extremely encouraged by what some of the courts are doing in some of the countries. I'll give you the example of Netherlands. I was really shocked and happy that the National Court Netherlands actually held Shell accountable. Yeah, it's unbelievable that the domestic court is telling one of the corporate citizens, I hold you accountable, And I think in some other countries, the national courts have done the same, So we need that because if we don't have that, there's no other way to enforce international rules and international norms, So we need national courts to take the view that we have a role to play. We should hold our corporate citizens accountable for their actions, both here in our country and globally.
We have a few more questions. And from Lekar Lim asking about your thoughts on COP26 and COP27.
Yeah. I must congratulate the British Minister, Alok Sharma, who did a super job chairing COP26. And I think that although it didn't get everything, COP26 was, in my view, a great success. Apart from the pledges to stop deforestation by 2030, for the first time, there's a universal consensus to phase down the use of coal, And at the national level in Singapore, for example, there's a big question by the financial institution whether or not they should stop funding coal mines. And I'm very proud of the fact that one of my banks here, DBS Bank, has taken the lead to say, from now on, we will stop funding coal mines. I hope other banks follow them, And I think Glasgow also raised the urgency of the situation to all the countries, And as a result of Glasgow, many countries which were previously hesitant, like my own Singapore, but after Glasgow, my Prime Minister have come forward to say, we will be carbon neutral by or around 2050. And for us, this is not an easy thing to do because we don't have hydro, very limited space for solar, no wind. So what we are doing now is to import hydropower from Laos. We are planning to import solar power from Indonesia and Australia, and do other remarkable technological things that were previously not possible. So COP26, in my view, was a success. But the one area in which it didn't make the progress everybody hoped for was the question of financing. Yeah. So we're looking to COP27 in Egypt to see whether we can come to some agreement on the need for the rich country to help the poorer country make this transition to a low carbon economy.
Yes, I think we're all looking towards what's going to happen in Sharm el-Sheikh and the question of the financing also for the adaptation measures, that not only the mitigations, but the adaptation measures. So there's also another interesting question, I think very broad, but difficult. I think that's the question that is very difficult to answer, but I'll put it out anyway by Lydia Kohler. Whether you think we can actually achieve a healthy environment and sustainable use of all resources and enough space for biodiversity to thrive with a human population of almost 8 billion and the lifestyle that we have. So these are really the fundamental questions that I'm not sure even you, Tommy, can answer, but I'm sure you will try.
I think it's not easy, but we must try, right? And I would say that if a small country like Singapore with so limited land, and a very, very high density population, a lot of business and industry, if we can do it, I think other bigger countries can, And we are really trying in Singapore to coexist with nature. Over the year, when Lee Kuan Yew was Prime Minister, his vision was to make Singapore a garden city. Then his successors say, let's go beyond a garden city and make Singapore a city in a garden. And now the new leader said, that's not enough. Let's make Singapore a city in nature, And I'm very happy to report that in this highly dense environment, species which were thought had become extinct have returned to Singapore. The hornbill bird, wild boars, otters, all kinds of species have come back to Singapore because they find the environment hospitable. Hunting is banned in Singapore, and nobody's allowed to capture wild birds for pets. So it can be done, it can be done. We don't have enough space to have very large solar farms. So we do the next best thing, buy solar power from our neighbor. We have no hydro, so we do the next best thing, buy solar power from Laos. But every citizen must embrace this objective. Every citizen must say, I share the aspiration that my city will be a city in nature. And the other thing we're trying to do is that in this decade, the 20s, we're going to plant 1 million additional trees. Singapore is already a very green city, but the ambition is to plant 1 million new trees. And after only 2 years, 2022, we've already planted 400,000 new trees. So it can be done, it can be done. So my message is one that, yes, it's a good aspiration to have. It can be done, but the battle must be fought at a local level. We can't win the global battle if we don't win the battle in our own country. So my response to the questioner is that it's up to each of us to embrace this vision and mission and make it come true in our own country.
Absolutely, Tommy. I think that it starts from the home, basically, and cumulatively. And I think you highlight, again, you wanted to take a positive perspective, and that is important. One thing we do know is that if we take care of nature, it comes back.
Yeah, exactly.
And we see that. And it's amazing, the resilience, if we just, give it a time to rest and take care of on nature. There was some even hopeful news about coral reefs.
Yes.
So I think that this is a powerful message you give.
Yeah, and I want to say that I just wrote the foreword of a new book that's just been published by two young Singaporeans. These two fellows, Robin and Marcus, are crazy about dragonflies and damselflies. And they've actually managed to photograph all the species native to Singapore. We have 116 species of dragonflies and damselflies, which are native to Singapore. And they just published a few guides to them, So we need young people like them, to tell us what do we have, what's our natural heritage, and why it's important to us, and why we must preserve our dragonflies, our butterflies, our bees, all kinds of insects, flowers, animals.
Tommy, that's what makes you so remarkable. You will write a foreword about a book on dragonflies and with passion. I know, it's so heartfelt. It's really inspirational.
Thank you.
So tell me, we have another question, and this is one that is, I think, crosses over into the UNCLOS. This is from Linda Liu, who thanks you profusely. Thank you, Tommy, ! Wonderful lecture. And she's asking about the ongoing IGC 5 negotiations for the high seas, areas beyond national jurisdiction. The president of that conference is also a Singaporean and very dear friend, Rina Lee. So can you comment on that? And I have to say, is this, from looking at it also from part 12, the UNCLOS perspective. So any thoughts on that, Tommy?
They are meeting right now in New York.
Yep.
The last time I asked Rina Lee, she seemed quite confident that they will succeed at this session and that they will get an agreement. So let's hope she's right. I think the technical problem can be solved. The question is whether the countries taking part in the negotiation have the political will to conclude the negotiation and adopt the agreement. At the end of the day, it's always a question of political will. Is there a political will to conclude this negotiation and to adopt an agreement? From the point of view of the chair, Rina Lee, it can be done at this session.
She's doing a great job. I think it's not easy at all. And also there was the pandemic, which didn't make things helpful. But so fingers crossed, they're in the last stretch now. As you know, and I'm sure they're burning the midnight oil as well. So I see someone, and Patricia, if you allow me, I was going to have you take the next question, but I see someone, John Scanlon, a very dear friend and someone who's devoted an entire career at many levels, starting from the IUCN, CITES, and environmental issues. So I'm going to take his question, and welcome. Thank you for joining us, John. Wonderful session. Thank you. After over 50 years of making international environmental law, the state of the environment continues to deteriorate. Some are now questioning the value and effectiveness of multilateral environmental agreements. You mentioned the ineffectiveness of the CBD in your remarks. What is your personal perspective on the value of MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements? Thank you, and John. Thanks, John.
Well, we may not have done well on CBD, but can you imagine if we don't have the UNFCCC, if we don't have the Paris Agreement, then we'll be lost, right? So there's really no alternative but for these multilateral environmental agreements. Climate change is the most important environmental issue facing us right now. And I would say we're very lucky that in 1992, we signed the UNFCCC, and in 2015, we adopted the Paris Agreement. These are the pillars that uphold our continuing enterprise, to do the right thing and to protect the atmosphere.
Well, let me try to pick one more. I mean, I see the list of questions is growing and growing, and that just shows the interest in listening to you, Tommy. But maybe I'll pick one that goes back to a point that you made initially about the north-south divide. It's a question from Yash Vardham, and it's the following. You've been mentioning about the blurring of the north-south divide thanks to the diplomacy, as you've pointed out. What role do you think common but differentiated responsibility has played in achieving that? So a question about CBDR and the north-south divide.
I put that in a Rio declaration, but my American friend did like that, you know. I guess you could say that the Kyoto Protocol reflected this. Yeah? The Kyoto Protocol basically exempted the developing country and put the entire burden on the developed country. This was tenable a long time ago, you know. But if you look at the world today, the largest emitter nation is not the United States, but China. And India is rapidly catching up. So it is no longer possible to say that because of all the historical wrong they did, the burden must rest exclusively on the developed countries. The Paris Agreement is right, that all of us must make a sacrifice. And we determine what sacrifice we're willing to make. But our unilateral declaration will be peer-reviewed. And every 5 years, we'll be urged to be more ambitious and to make a better nationally determined contribution. This is the beauty of the Paris Agreement, and I salute France for having broken through what was an impossible problem and to persuade everybody that we are all in this together. And whether you're a rich country or not so rich country, we can all make a contribution.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was looking at the list of questions and seeing the time. I think we have two minutes to go, so maybe it's not very fair to go for another question, but I register with great interest the number of questions and very interesting comments that we've had in the chat, but maybe it's time to close. And I think from Nilfer and myself, we can only say, and I'm sure that's the same with all the participants that we've had in today's webinar, that it's always an honor, and somebody said that in the chat, and a pleasure to listen to you, Tommy, and to learn from you. We've learned so much. I mean, as we always say, we can always learn something new. You always manage to surprise us with a bit of history and anecdote from your so rich experience that allowed us to spend 1 hour in commemorating the Rio Declaration, the 30 years of the Rio Declaration, but also in making an assessment of what happened in the last 30 years, as we've said, and a mixed assessment, but I think you really emphasize the positive outlook that we should have on things. I think we are at the stage, and your answers elucidated that, where public opinion and especially the young generations are very committed, where governments are very aware the north-south divide on this maybe is blurred or is different. And indeed, certainly, there is a commitment also from the private sector, civil society, and I think that gives us reasons for a positive outlook, but certainly stressing the need that we need to continue the efforts that were started in Stockholm, then emphasized in Rio, and then with all the further developments, we need to continue. And this is not the end of the road for sure, but we have to keep a positive outlook, as you say, and that's also so inspiring always from the conversations that we have with you. So Thank you so much, Tommy. I don't know if you
Thank
want
you.
to say a final word, Nilofer.
I just thank you, Tommy. I mean, always, again, even though I've been studying and teaching environmental law and all these issues, I've learned a lot from you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You have remarkable experience and a fabulous memory, can I say? I mean, the detail and your thoughts. So you can see we have so many applauses and thanks, and I think we have to continue this conversation. I feel we just got started. So thank you so much, really.
Thank you, Nilofer. Thank you, Patricia. I enjoyed the webinar. We'll do it again.
Yeah, great, fantastic. Stay tuned, everyone out there.
Bye-bye.
We'll be back.